why don't we start off? Can you just explain what do you mean by the Empire's Workshop?
Well, I wrote the original book in 2005, 2004, when I was it was after the first blast of insanity after 9/11, when went into Afghanistan and Iraq, and then, some neocons were wanting to push further. And I was trying to make sense why all of a sudden all these old Iran-Contra hands and Central American hands suddenly became very prominent in this bid to project U.S. power into the Persian Gulf. Elliot Abram, we can go through the list, but and a lot of them would connected to Central American tangential ways. Dick Cheney himself wrote the Minority Report for Iran-Contra, and where he advocated for a plus ultra definition of the executive power, imperial presidency that at the time seemed marginalized but then by the time you get to 2004 was just part of national policy. So I started looking at Central America specifically and Iran-Contra as the training ground, as the place that basically brought together a generation of these new right militarists, and thinking about this Reagan Central American campaigns as a crucible that reconciles and contradictory constituencies and coalitions and ideas. So you can bring the secular neocons with the religious theocons, with the old traditional workhorses of law and order anti-communism, with the radicalized vets like Ollie North, radicalized to the right after Vietnam, counterinsurgent theorists. Central America kind of brings them together and creates a coalition. It creates a political realignment, an aspiring coalition that gives that makes sense of the crisis, that helps make sense of the crisis, and helps overcome contradictions within that coalition. And then the book became a little bit more ambitious to look at how Latin America as a whole serves that function within the United States. So we all know the story about Latin America. We all know Latin America and interventionism, something like 42 regime changes between 1898 and 1992 alone that Washington presided over. The famous ones, the tragic ones, Allende and Arbenz, the taking of Mexico, so many more that we can't even, that most people don't even know about. The U.S.'s first coup in Mexico was in the mid 1820s, in which an ambassador who was a member of the Scott Rite Freemasonry set up a bunch of lodges to counter the influence of the York Rite Freemasons that were much more confrontational to the United States and basically undermined, using a kind of classic civil society strategy of destabilization. So anyway, that's just one example. But the main point was the way Central America serves during moments of crisis, domestic crisis, when one coalition is on its way out because their worldview can no longer help organize the world effectively, can no longer focus U.S. power effectively, and a new ascendant coalition is arising. And we can go back through the history of the United States, going back to the founders and the Jacksonians and the Civil War and the progressives, and Central America, Latin America plays a role in each of those coalitions. So that's what I mean by a workshop. It's also a workshop where the U.S. works out strategies that it then applies elsewhere in the world. So that there's that part of the phrase workshop. But the main part of the book is thinking about how domestic political coalitions use Latin America to get a sense of themselves, to be a class not just of themselves, but for themselves.
And to maybe go further back in U.S. history, can you kind of talk about what was unique about the United States in terms of its kind of limitless expansion? And how did that kind of affect the rest of the trajectory of U.S. history?
Well, yeah. I mean, this was more of a topic of the end of the myth and from the frontier to the border wall. But when you think about the United States, there's not too many, not too many countries has had the luxury to indulge in actual and fantasized expansion as the United States, whether it be across the landed continent and then into markets and militarisms, and just an ability to constantly organize domestic politics by invoking the promise of limitless growth. In some ways, that's why the United States is the ideal capitalist nation. And in some ways, that's the key to understanding why the cult of individual rights is so deep in the United States. Because if capitalism itself is predicated on the need to constantly expand, right? That is, in some ways, capitalism 101. There are, the mechanisms of growth, the dynamics of growth. The United States has materially been the nation that has most closely embodied that ideal, and where other countries, and of course other empires expanded. The British Empire expanded across the world. There were non-Western empires. But in terms of embracing the idea of growth as a central component of one's political culture, and then linking it very clearly to a definition of citizenship and rights that took individual rights as sacred and sacrosanct, and took social rights as perverse and dangerous. I think the United States is unique in doing that. And so then the question, of course, is what happens when the United States hits limits, right? And what happens when the United States hits a wall, so to speak, and in terms of limits to growth, and how does one adapt to a new political culture and navigate that transition in a way that would be humane and not barbaric? I think is one of the central questions that I tried to look at in the end of the myth.